The power of the presidency is so vast that it is probably a good thing, in retrospect, that only a very few people in this country understood the gravity of Richard Nixon's mental condition during his last year in the White House. There were moments in that year when even his closest friends and advisors were convinced that the President of the United States was so crazy with rage and booze and suicidal despair that he was only 2 martinis away from losing his grip entirely and suddenly locking himself in his office long enough to make that single telephone call that would have launched enough missiles and bombers to blow the whole world off its axis, or at least kill 100 million people. The sudden, hellish reality of a nuclear war with either Russia or China, or both, was probably the only thing that could have salvaged Nixon's presidency after the Supreme Court ruled that he had to yield up the incriminating tapes that he knew would finish him off. Would the action-starved generals at the Strategic Air Command headquarters have ignored an emergency order from their commander-in-chief? And how long would it have taken Pat Buchanan or General Haig to realize that the boss had finally flipped?
I can't believe it, the way you look sometimes, like a trampled flag on a city street. Oh yeah, and I don't want it, the things you're offering me, symbolized barcode, quick ID. Oh yeah, 'cause I'm a 21st century digital boy. I don't know how to live, but I got a lot of toys. My daddy's a lazy middle class intellectual. My mommy's on Valium, so ineffectual. A life of mystery, yeah. I can't explain it, the things you're saying to me. It's going yeah, 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 yeah. Oh yeah, 'cause I'm a 21st century digital boy. I don't know how to read, but I got a lot of toys. My daddy's a lazy middle class intellectual. My mommy's on Valium, so ineffectual. A life of mystery, I'm trying to tell you about love.
And welcome back to Undoctrinated.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, that looks good now. You're actually showing up on the recording here.
Oh, good.
Okay, so take 2 on this intro.
All right, sounds good. Take 2.
This is a special episode. You know why?
Why?
Because this is a bonus episode.
You're welcome, everybody.
I think this is a first for Undoctrinated. We don't usually do bonus episodes, but it is almost the new year, so
You're welcome.
that's right. So spend a little overtime listening, because we spent a little overtime recording this for you.
Exactly.
But you're
Special
gonna love
treats
it.
for you for the new year.
Yeah, and this is also our second installment of a Hunter S Thompson short story. So if you like
What a
the
treat.
Yeah, if you like The Great Shark Hunt, you're gonna like this one at least as much. This is Hunter S Thompson covering Jimmy Carter's Law Day speech in 1974.
And it's a good one, people.
Oh, I love this story.
It's so good.
It's going to be a little over an hour, I think. I recorded it in 5 different parts, but I think I'm going to try and fuse them all together because I had to stop recording in between. You can't just read a short story for 90 minutes or whatever all the way through.
Yeah,
And
it gets
expect to
difficult.
fucking do it nonstop. So occasionally I paused it. My phone goes off every once in a while. I'm reading it off my phone. I'm getting texts throughout, and I have some people come
Tim's
over.
a popular man, people.
Yeah, I think Ernie stopped by, so I had to stop it for that. I had a dinner timer go off
Yeah.
mid read, but
Lots of things happening.
it's not so bad. It's not as bad as it sounds. There's just a couple brief interruptions throughout, but it is good. I pick up right where I left off and keep going. I'll try and put it together so it sounds the best possible. So buckle up.
We hope you enjoy.
Enjoy. This is Hunter S. Thompson covering Jimmy Carter's Law Day speech in 1974. He wrote this
Great
in
times.
1976. I believe this was part of him covering the 1976 presidential
Yeah, I
campaign.
think so.
So
Pretty sure.
here we go.
Networks capsized, it's gonna sink to the
All right, testing. Yeah, how we doing? Okay. I got a friend Ernie on the way, so he'll probably be calling in the middle of this. I'll just pause it when he does, and also have a timer set for dinner. I'm cooking some short ribs, so that'll also interfere with this, but that's okay, because it's still going to be good. To the text. If any person shall carnally know in any manner any brute animal, or carnally know any male or female person by the anus, or by and with the mouth, or voluntarily submit to such carnal knowledge, he or she shall be guilty of a felony, and shall be confined in the penitentiary not less than 1 year, nor more than 3 years. Commonwealth of Virginia Anti-Sodomy Statute, 1792. One of the most difficult problems for a journalist covering a presidential campaign is getting to know the candidates well enough to make confident judgments about them, because it is just about impossible for a journalist to establish a personal relationship with any candidate who has already made the big leap from long shot to serious contender. The problem becomes more and more serious as the stakes get higher, and by the time a candidate has survived enough primaries to convince himself and his staff that they will all be eating their lunches in the White House mess for the next 4 years, he is long past the point of having either the time or the inclination to treat any journalist who doesn't already know him personally as anything but just another face in the campaign press corps. There are many complex theories about the progressive stages of a presidential campaign, but for the moment, let's say there are 3. Stage 1 is the period between the decision to run for president and the morning after the New Hampshire primary, when the field is still crowded. The staff organizations are still loose and relaxed, and most candidates are still hungry for all the help they can get, especially media exposure, so they can get their names in the Gallup poll. Stage 2 is the winnowing out, the separating of the sheep from the goats, when the 2 or 3 survivors of the early primaries begin looking like long-distance runners with a realistic shot at the party nomination. And Stage 3 begins whenever the national media, the public opinion polls, and Mayor Daley of Chicago decide that a candidate has picked up enough irreversible momentum to begin looking like at least a probable nominee and a possible next president. This 3-stage breakdown is not rooted in any special wisdom or scientific analysis, but it fits both the 1972 and 1976 Democratic campaigns well enough to make the point that any journalist who doesn't get a pretty firm personal fix on a candidate while he's still in Stage 1 might just as well, with his or her instincts all the way to Election Day in November. Because once a candidate gets to Stage 2, his whole lifestyle changes drastically. At that point, he becomes a public figure, a serious contender, and the demands on his time and energy begin escalating to levels of madness. He wakes up every morning to face a split-second, 18-hour-a-day schedule of meetings, airports, speeches, press conferences, motorcades, and handshaking. Instead of rambling, off-the-cuff talks over a drink or two with reporters from small-town newspapers, he is suddenly flying all over the country in his own chartered jet full of syndicated columnists and network TV stars. Cameras and microphones follow him everywhere he goes, and instead of pleading long and earnestly for the support of 15 amateur political activists gathered in some English professor's living room in Keene, New Hampshire, he is reading the same cliché-riddled speech, often 3 or 4 times in a single day, to vast auditoriums full of people who either laugh or applaud at the wrong times, and who may or may not be supporters. And all the fat cats, labor leaders, and big-time Poles who couldn't find the time to return his phone calls when he was desperately looking for help a few months ago are now ringing his phone off the hook within minutes after his arrival in whatever Boston, Miami, or Milwaukee hotel his managers have booked him into that night. But they are not calling to offer their help and support. They just want to make sure he understands that they don't plan to help or support anybody else until they get to know him a little better. It is a very mean game that these high-rolling, cold-hearted hustlers play. The President of the United States may no longer be the most powerful man in the world, but he is still close enough to be sure that nobody else in the world is going to cross him by accident. And anybody who starts looking like he might get his hands on that kind of power had better get comfortable, right from the start, with the certain knowledge that he is going to have to lean on some very mean people and merciless people just to get himself elected. The power of the presidency is so vast that it is probably a good thing, in retrospect, that only a very few people in this country understood the gravity of Richard Nixon's mental condition during his last year in the White House. There were moments in that year when even his closest friends and advisors were convinced that the President of the United States was so crazy with rage and booze and suicidal despair that he was only 2 martinis away from losing his grip entirely and suddenly locking himself in his office long enough to make that single telephone call that would have launched enough missiles and bombers to blow the whole world off its axis, or at least kill 100 million people. The sudden, hellish reality of a nuclear war with either Russia or China, or both, was probably the only thing that could have salvaged Nixon's presidency after the Supreme Court ruled that he had to yield up the incriminating tapes that he knew would finish him off. Would the action-starved generals at the Strategic Air Command headquarters have ignored an emergency order from their commander-in-chief? And how long would it have taken Pat Buchanan or General Haig to realize that the boss had finally flipped? Nixon spent so much time alone that nobody else in the White House would have given his absence a second thought until he failed to show up for dinner. And by that time, he could have made enough phone calls to start wars all over the world. A 4-star general commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps with 3 wars and 35 years of fanatical devotion to duty, honor, and country in his system would hack off his own feet and eat them rather than refuse to obey a direct order from the President of the United States, even if he thought the President was crazy. The key to all military thinking is a concept that nobody who ever wore a uniform with even one stripe on it will ever forget. You don't salute the man, you salute the uniform. Once you've learned that, you're a soldier, and soldiers don't disobey orders from people they have to salute. If Nixon's tortured mind had bent far enough to let him think he could save himself by ordering a full-bore Marine airborne invasion of Cuba, he would not have given the boom-boom order to some closet pacifist general who might be inclined to delay the invasion long enough to call Henry Kissinger for official reassurance that the president was not insane. No West Pointer with 4 stars on his hat would take that kind of risk anyway. By the time word got back to the White House or to Kissinger that Nixon had given the order to invade Cuba, the whole Caribbean would be a sea of fire. Fidel Castro would be in a submarine on his way to Russia, and the sky above the Atlantic would be streaked from one horizon to the other with the vapor trails of 100 panic-launched missiles. Right. But it was mainly a matter of luck that Nixon's mental disintegration was so obvious and so crippling that by the time he came face to face with his final option, he was no longer able to even recognize it. When the going got tough, the politician who worshipped toughness above all else turned into a whimpering, gin-soaked vegetable. But it is still worth wondering how long it would have taken Haig and Kissinger to convince all those SAC generals out in Omaha to disregard a doomsday phone call from the President of the United States because a handful of civilians in the White House said he was crazy. But we are wandering off into wild speculation again, so let's chop it off right here. We were talking about the vast powers of the presidency and all the treacherous currents surrounding it. Not to mention all the riptides, ambushes, Judah's goats, fools, and ruthless, dehumanized thugs that will sooner or later have to be dealt with by any presidential candidate who still feels strong on his feet when it comes to that magic moment for the leap from stage 2 to stage 3. But there will be plenty of time for that later on, and plenty of other journalists to write about it, but not me. The most active and interesting phase of a presidential campaign is stage 1, which is as totally different from the Sturm und Drang of stage 3 as a guerrilla-style war among 6 or 8 gypsy nations is totally different from the bloody hunkered-down trench warfare that paralyzed and destroyed half of Europe during World War II. Oh, sorry, World War I. Okay. Athens, Alabama. Eladian Tribble, who had said she would marry entertainer Elvis Presley on Saturday, confirmed Sunday that the ceremony did not take place. Mrs. Tribble, a 42-year-old widow with 4 children, was asked in a telephone interview why the wedding did not take place. She replied, quote, "This is the Sabbath day, and I don't talk about things like this on the Lord's day," end quote. Well, that's fair enough, I guess. Jimmy Carter had said that he won't talk about his foreign policy until the day he delivers his inaugural address. Everybody had a right to their own quirks and personal convictions, as long as they don't try to lay them on me. But just for the pure, mean-spirited hell of it, I am going to call Eladian Tribble when the sun comes up in about 3 hours and ask her the same question the AP reporter insulted her faith by asking on the Sabbath. By Mrs. Tribble's own logic, I should get a perfectly straight answer from her on Tuesday, which according to my calendar is not a religious holiday of any kind. So in just a few hours, I should have the answer from Eladian herself to the question regarding her mysterious non-marriage to Elvis Presley. And after I talk to Eladian, I am going to call my old friend Pat Cadell, who is Jimmy Carter's pollster and one of the 2 or 3 main wizards in Carter's brain trust, and we will have another one of our daily philosophical chats. When I read Mrs. Tribble's quote to Pat earlier today, when I read Mrs. Tribble's quote to Pat earlier today, in the course of a more or less bare-knuckled telephone talk, he said he didn't know any woman named Eladian in Athens, Alabama, and besides that, he didn't see any connection between her and the main topic of our conversation tonight, which was Jimmy Carter, who is always the main topic when I talk to Cadell, and we've been talking, arguing, plotting, haggling, and generally whipping on each other almost constantly ever since this third-rate, low-rent campaign circus hit the public roads about 4 months ago. That was before Pat went to work for Jimmy, but long after I'd been cited in about 33 dozen journals all over the country as one of Carter's earliest and most fervent supporters. Everywhere I went for at least the past year, from Los Angeles to Austin, Nashville, Washington, Boston, Chicago, and Key West, I've been publicly hammered by friends and strangers alike for saying that I like Jimmy Carter. I have been jeered by large crowds for saying this. I have been mocked in print by liberal pundits and other Gucci people. I have been called a brain-damaged geek by some of my best and oldest friends. My own wife threw a knife at me on the night of the Wisconsin primary when the midnight radio stunned us both with a news bulletin from a CBS station in Los Angeles, saying that earlier announcements by NBC and ABC regarding Mo Udall's narrow victory over Carter in Wisconsin were not true, and that late returns from the rural districts were running so heavily in Carter's favor that CBS was now calling him the winner. Sandy likes Mo Udall, and so do I for that matter. I also like Jerry Jeff Walker, the scofflaw king of New Orleans, and a lot of other people I don't necessarily believe should be president of the United States. The immense concentration of power in that office is just too goddamn heavy for anybody with good sense to turn his back on, or her back, or its back. At least not as long as whatever lives in the White House has the power to fill vacancies on the U.S. Supreme Court, because anybody with that kind of power can use it, like Nixon did, to crowd the court of final appeal in this country with the same kind of lame, vindictive yo-yos who recently voted to sustain the Commonwealth of Virginia's anti-sodomy statutes. And anybody who thinks that 6-3 vote against sodomy is some kind of abstract legal gibberish that doesn't really affect them, and had better hope they never get busted for anything the Bible or any local vice squad cop calls an unnatural sex act. because unnatural is defined by the laws of almost every state in the Union as anything but a quick and dutiful hump in the classic missionary position for purposes of procreation only. Anything else is a felony crime, and people who commit felony crimes go to prison. Which won't make much difference to me. I took that fatal dive off the straight and narrow path so long ago that I can't remember when I first became a felon, but I have been one ever since, and it's way too late to change now. In the eyes of the law, my whole life has been one long and sinful felony. I have sinned repeatedly, as often as possible, and just as soon as I can get away from this goddamn galvanist typewriter, I'm going to get right after it again. God knows I hate it, but I can't help myself after all these criminal years. Like Waylon Jennings said, the devil made me do it in the first time. The second time, I done it on my own. Right. And the third time, I did it because of brain damage. And after that, well, I figured that anybody who was already doomed to a life of crime and sin might as well learn to love it. Anything worth all that risk and an energy almost has to be beyond the reach of any kind of redemption except the power of pure love. And this flash of twisted wisdom brings us back, strangely enough, to politics, Pat Cadell, and the 1976 presidential campaign. And not incidentally, to the fact that any journalist on any side of Wall Street that ever quoted me as saying, "I like Jimmy Carter," was absolutely accurate. I have said it many times to many people, and I will keep on saying it until Jimmy Carter gives me some good reason to change my mind, which might happen about 2 minutes after he finishes reading this article, but I doubt it. I have known Carter for more than 2 years, and I've probably spent more private, human time with him than any other journalist on the 76 campaign trail. The first time I met him, at about 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning in 1974, at the back door of the governor's mansion in Atlanta, I was about 2 degrees on the safe side of berserk, raving and babbling at Carter and his whole bemused family about some hostile bastard wearing a Georgia State Police uniform who had tried to prevent me from coming through the gate at the foot of the long, tree-shaded driveway leading up to the mansion. I had been up all night, in the company of serious degenerates, and when I rolled up to the gatehouse in the back, oh boy, here's Ernie. Okay, hang on 1 second. Hello? Hey. Alright, cool. Okay, where was I? Still, by the way, waiting for my timer to interrupt me regarding my short ribs. Anyway, back to the text. I had been up all night in the company of serious degenerates, and when I rolled up to the gatehouse in the back seat of a taxi I'd hailed in downtown Atlanta, the trooper was not amused by the sight and sound of my presence. I was trying to act calm, but after about 30 seconds I realized it wasn't working. The look on his face told me I was not getting through to the man. He stared at me, saying nothing, while I explained from my crouch in the back seat of the cab that I was late for breakfast with the governor and Ted Kennedy. Then he suddenly stiffened and began shouting at the cab driver. "What kind of dumb shit are you trying to pull, buddy? Don't you know where you are?" Before the cabbie could answer, the trooper smacked the flat of his hand down on the hood so hard that the whole cab rattled. "You! Shut this engine!" He pointed at me. "You, out of the cab! Let's see some identification!" He reached out for my wallet and motioned for me to follow him into the gatehouse. The cabbie started to follow, but the trooper waved him back. "Stay right where you are, good buddy. I'll get to you." The look on my driver's face said we were both going to jail, and it was my fault. "It wasn't my idea to come out here," he whined. "This guy told me he was invited for breakfast with the governor." The trooper was looking at the press cards in my wallet. I was already pouring sweat, and just as he looked over at me, I realized I was holding a can of beer in my hand. "You always bring your own beer when you have breakfast with the governor?" he asked. I shrugged and dropped it in a nearby wastebasket. "You!" he shouted. "What do you think you're doing?" The scene went on for another 20 minutes. There were many phone calls, a lot of yelling, and finally the trooper reached somebody in the mansion who agreed to locate Senator Kennedy and asked him if he knew some guy name of Thompson. I got him down here. He's all bearded up and wants to come up there for breakfast. Jesus, I thought, that's all Kennedy needs to hear. Right in the middle of breakfast with the governor of Georgia, some nervous old darky shuffles in from the kitchen to announce that the trooper down at the gatehouse is holding some drunkard who says he's a friend of Senator Kennedy's, and he wants to come in and have breakfast. Which was, in fact, a lie. I had not been invited for breakfast with the governor, and up to that point I had done everything in my power to avoid it. Breakfast is the only meal of the day that I tend to view with the same kind of traditionalized reverence that most people associate with lunch and dinner. I like to eat breakfast alone, and almost never before noon. Anybody with a terminally jangled lifestyle needs at least one psychic anchor every 24 hours, and mine is breakfast. In Hong Kong, Dallas, or at home, and regardless of whether or not I have been to bed, breakfast is a personal ritual that can only be properly observed alone. And in spirit of genuine excess, the food factor should always be massive. 4 Bloody Marys, 2 grapefruits, a pot of coffee, Rangoon crepes, a half-pound of either sausage, bacon, or corned beef hash with diced chilies, a Spanish omelet or eggs Benedict, a quart of milk, a chopped lemon for random seasoning, and something like a slice of key lime pie, 2 margaritas, and 6 lines of the best cocaine for dessert. Right. And there should also be 2 or 3 newspapers, all mail and messages and telephone, a notebook for planning the next 24 hours, and at least one source of good music, all of which should be dealt with outside in the warmth of the hot sun, and preferably stone naked. It is not going to be easy for those bastards out in San Francisco who have been waiting all day in a condition of extreme fear and anxiety for my long and finely reasoned analysis of the meaning of Jimmy Carter to come roaring out of my faithful mojo wire and across 2,000 miles of telephone line to understand why I am sitting here in a Texas motel full of hookers and writing at length on the meaning of breakfast. But like almost everything else worth understanding, the explanation for this is deceptively quick and basic. After more than 10 years of trying to deal with politics and politicians in a professional manner, I have finally come to the harsh understanding that there is no way at all, not even for a doctor of chemotherapy with total access to the whole spectrum of legal and illegal drugs, the physical constitution of a mule shark, and a brain as rare and as sharp and original as the Sloat Diamond, to function as a political journalist without abandoning the whole concept of a decent breakfast. I have worked like 12 bastards for more than a decade to be able to have it both ways, but the conflict is too basic and too deeply rooted in the nature of both politics and breakfast to ever be reconciled. It is one of those very few great forks in the road of life that cannot be avoided. Like a Jesuit priest who is also a practicing nudist, with a $200 a day smack habit, wanting to be the first naked pope, or Pope Naked the First, if we want to use the language of the church, or a vegetarian pacifist with a .44 Magnum fetish who wants to run for president without giving up his membership in the National Rifle Association, or his New York City pistol permit that allows him to wear twin 6 guns on the Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and all of his press conferences. There are some combinations that nobody can handle. Shooting bats on the wing with a double-barreled .410 and a head full of gypsum weed is one of them, and another is the idea that it is possible for a freelance writer with at least 4 close friends named Jones to cover a hopelessly scrambled presidential campaign better than any 6-man team of career political journalists on the New York Times or the Washington Post, and still eat a 3-hour breakfast in the sun every morning. but I had not made the final decision on that morning when I rolled up to the gatehouse of the governor's mansion in Atlanta to have breakfast with Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy. My reason for being there at that hour was simply to get my professional schedule back in phase with Kennedy's political obligations for that day. He was scheduled to address a crowd of establishment heavies who would convene at the University of Georgia Law School at 10:30 in the morning to officially witness the unveiling of a huge, prestigious oil portrait of former Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and his tentative schedule for Saturday called for him to leave the governor's mansion after breakfast and make the 60-mile trip to Athens by means of the governor's official airplane. So in order to hook up with Kennedy and make the trip with him, I had no choice but to meet him for breakfast at the mansion, where he had spent the previous night at Carter's invitation. Oddly enough, I had also been invited to spend Friday night in a bedroom at the governor's mansion. I had come down from Washington with Kennedy on Friday afternoon, and since I was the only journalist traveling with him that weekend, Governor Carter had seen fit to include me when he invited the Kennedy party to overnight at the mansion instead of a downtown hotel. But I am rarely in the right frame of mind to spend the night in the house of a politician, at least not if I can spend it anywhere else. And on the previous night, I figured I would be a lot happier in a room at the Regency Hyatt House than I would in the governor's mansion, which may or may not have been true, but regardless of all that, I still had to be at the mansion for breakfast if I wanted to get any work done that weekend, and my work was to stay with Ted Kennedy. The scene at the gate had unhinged me so thoroughly that I couldn't find the door I'd been told to knock on when I finally got out of my cab at the mansion, and by the time I finally got inside, I was in no shape at all to deal with Jimmy Carter and his whole family. I didn't even recognize Carter when he met me at the door. All I knew was that a middle-aged man wearing Levi's was taking me into the dining room, where I insisted on sitting down for a while, until the tremors passed. One of the first things I noticed about Carter, after I'd calmed down a bit, was the relaxed and confident way he handled himself with Ted Kennedy. The contrast between the two was so stark that I am still surprised whenever I hear somebody talking about the eerie resemblance between Carter and John F. Kennedy. I have never noticed it, except every once in a while in some carefully staged photograph, and if there was ever a time when it seems like any such resemblance should have been impossible to miss, it was that morning in Atlanta when I walked into the dining room and saw Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy sitting about 6 feet apart at the same table. Kennedy, whose presence usually dominates any room he walks into, was sitting there looking stiff and vaguely uncomfortable in his dark blue suit and black shoes. He glanced up as I entered and smiled faintly. Then he went back to staring at a portrait on the wall on the other side of the room. Paul Kirk, his executive wizard, was sitting next to him, wearing the same blue suit and black shoes, and Jimmy King, his executive advance man, was off in the distant corner yelling into a telephone. There were about 15 other people in the room, most of them laughing and talking, and it took me a while to notice that nobody was talking to Kennedy, which is a very rare thing to see, particularly in any situation involving other politicians or even politically conscious people. Kennedy was obviously not in a very gregarious mood that morning, and I didn't learn why until an hour or so later when I found myself in one of the Secret Service cars with King, Kirk, and Kennedy running at top speed on the highway to Athens. The mood in the car was ugly. Kennedy was yelling at the SS driver for missing a turnoff that meant we'd be late for the unveiling. When we finally got there, and I had a chance to talk privately with Jimmy King, he said Carter had waited until the last minute, just before I got to the mansion, to advise Kennedy that a sudden change in his own plans made it impossible for him to lend Teddy his plane for the trip to Athens. That was the reason for the tension I half noticed when I got to the mansion. King had been forced to get on the phone immediately and locate the Secret Service detail and get 2 cars out to the mansion immediately. By the time they arrived, it was so obvious that we could not get to Athens in time for the unveiling of Rusk's portrait, which was fine with me, but Kennedy was scheduled to speak, and he was very unhappy. I refused to participate in any ceremony honoring a warmonger like Rusk. So I told King I would look around on the edge of the campus for a bar, and then meet them for lunch at the cafeteria for the Law Day luncheon. He was happy enough to see me go, because in the space of 3 or 4 minutes I had insulted a half a dozen people. There was a beer parlor about 10 minutes away, and I stayed there in relative peace until it was time for the luncheon. There was no way to miss the campus cafeteria. There was a curious crowd of about 200 students waiting to catch a glimpse of Ted Kennedy, who was signing autographs and moving slowly up the concrete steps towards the door as I approached. Jimmy King saw me coming and waited by the door. "Well, you missed the unveiling," he said with a smile. "You feel better?" "Not much," I replied. "They should have run the bloodthirsty bastard up a flagpole by his heels." King started to smile again, but his mouth suddenly froze, and I looked to my right just in time to see Dean Rusk's swollen face about 18 inches from my own. King reached out to shake his hand. "Congratulations, sir," he said. "We're all very proud of you." "Balls," I muttered. After Rusk had gone inside, King stared at me and shook his head sadly. "Why can't you just give the man some peace?" he said. "He's harmless now. Jesus, you'll get us in trouble yet." "Don't worry," I said. "He's deaf as a rock." "Maybe so," King replied. "But some of these people with him can hear okay. One of the women over there at the ceremony asked me who you were, and I said you were an undercover agent. But she was still pissed off about what you said." "You should have Senator Kennedy teach him some manners," she told me. "Not even a government agent should be allowed to talk like that in public." "Like what?" I said. "That stuff about blood on his hands?" King laughed. "Yeah, you really jolted her. Jesus, Hunter, you gotta remember, these are genteel people." He nodded solemnly. "And this is their turf. Dean Rusk is a goddamn national hero down here. What are his friends supposed to think when the senator comes down from Washington to deliver the eulogy at the unveiling of Rusk's portrait, and he brings some guy with him who starts asking people why the artist didn't paint any blood on the hands?" "Don't worry," I said. "Just tell him it's part of my deep cover. Hell, nobody connects me with Kennedy anyway. I've been careful to stay a safe distance away from you bastards. You think I want to be seen at a ceremony honoring Dean Rusk?" "Don't kid yourself," he asked as we walked inside. "They know you're with us. You wouldn't be here if they didn't. This is a very exclusive gathering, my boy. We're the only ones on the guest list without some kind of very serious title. They're all either judges or state senators or the Right Honorable this, the Right Honorable that." I looked around the room, and indeed there was no mistaking the nature of the crowd. This was not just a bunch of good old boys who all happened to be alumni of the University of Georgia Law. These were the honored alumni, the ranking 150 or so who had earned, stolen, or inherited enough distinction to be culled from the lists and invited to the unveiling of Rusk's portrait, followed by a luncheon with Senator Kennedy, Governor Carter, Judge Crater, and numerous other hyper-distinguished guests whose names I forget. And Jimmy King was right. This was not a natural habitat for anybody wearing dirty white basketball shoes, no tie, and nothing except Rolling Stone to follow his name on the guest list in that space reserved for titles. If it had been a gathering of distinguished alumni from the University of Georgia Medical School, the title space on the guest list would have been in front of the names, and I would have fit right in. Hell, I could have even joined a few conversations, and nobody would have given a second thought to any talk about blood on the hands. Right, but this was Law Day in Georgia, and I was the only doctor in the room. So I had to be passed off as some kind of undercover agent traveling for unknown reasons with Senator Kennedy. Not even Secret Service agents understand my role in the entourage. All they knew was that I had walked off the plane from Washington with Teddy, and I had been with them ever since. Nobody gets introduced to a Secret Service agent. They are expected to know who everybody is, and if they don't know, they act like they do and hope for the best. It is not my wont to take undue advantage of the Secret Service. We have gone through some heavy times together, as it were, And ever since I wandered into a room in the Baltimore Hotel in New York one night during the 1972 campaign and found 3 SS agents smoking a joint, I have felt pretty much at ease around them. So it seems only natural down in Georgia to ask one of the 4 agents in our detail for the keys to the trunk of his car so I could lock my leather satchel in a safe place instead of carrying it around with me. Actually, the agent had put the bag in the trunk on his own, rather than give me the key, but when I sat down at our table in the cafeteria and saw that the only available beverage was iced tea, I remembered that one of the things in my satchel was a quart of wild turkey, and I wanted it. On the table in front of me, and everyone else, was a tall glass of iced tea that looked to be the same color as bourbon. Each glass had a split slice of lemon on its rim. So I removed the lemon, poured the tea into Paul Kirk's water glass, and asked one of the agents at the next table for the key to the trunk. He hesitated for a moment, but one of the law school deans, or maybe Judge Crater, was already talking into the mic up there at the speaker's table, so the path of least disturbance was to give me the key, which he did. And I thought nothing of it until I got outside and opened the trunk. Kazart! If your life ever gets dull, check out the trunk of the next SS car you happen to see. You won't need a key. They open just as easily as any other trunk when a 6-foot whip steel is properly applied. But open the bugger carefully, because those gentlemen keep about 69 varieties of instant death inside. Jesus, I was literally staggered by the mass of weaponry in the back of the car. There were machine guns, gas masks, hand grenades, cartridge belts, tear gas canisters, ammo boxes, bulletproof vests, chains, saws, and probably a lot of other things. But all of a sudden, I realized that 2 passing students had stopped right next to me on the sidewalk, and I heard one of them say, "God Almighty, look at that stuff!" So I quickly filled my glass with wild turkey, put the bottle back in the trunk, and slammed it shut like you would slam any other trunk. And that was when I turned around to see Jimmy Carter coming at me with his head down, his teeth bared, and his eyes so wildly dilated that he looked like a springtime bat. What? No. That was later in the day, on my 3rd or 4th trip to the trunk with a glass of iced tea. I had been sitting here in a frozen, bewildered stupor for 50 or 55 minutes, trying to figure out where that last image came from. My memories of that day are extremely vivid, for the most part, and the more I think back on it now, the more certain I am that whatever I might have seen coming at me in that kind of bent-over, fast-swooping style of the springtime bat was not Governor Carter. Probably it was a hunchbacked student on his way to final exams in the School of Landscaping, or maybe just trying to walk fast and tie his shoes at the same time. Or it could have been nothing at all. There is no mention in my notebook about anything trying to sneak up on me in a high-speed crouch while I was standing out there on the street. According to my notes, in fact, Jimmy Carter had arrived at the cafeteria not long after Kennedy. And if he attracted any attention from the crowd that had come to see Teddy, I would probably have noticed it and made at least a small note to emphasize the contrast in style. Something like 12:09, Carter suddenly appears in low-moving crowd behind TK. No autographs, no bodyguards, and now a blue plastic suit instead of Levi's. No recognition, no greetings, just a small, sandy-haired man looking for somebody to shake hands with. That is the kind of note I would have made if I'd noticed his arrival at all, which I didn't, because it was not until around 10 o'clock on the night of the New Hampshire primary, almost 2 years later, that there was any real reason for a journalist to make a note on the time and style of Jimmy Carter's arrival for any occasion at all, and especially not in a crowd that had come to rub shoulders with big-time heavies like Ted Kennedy and Dean Rusk. He is not an imposing figure in any way, and even now, with his face on every TV screen in the country at least 5 nights a week, I'd be tempted to bet $100 to anybody else's $500 that Jimmy Carter could walk by himself and in a normal noonday crowd from one end of Chicago's huge O'Hare Airport to the other without being recognized by anybody, or at least not by anybody who had never met him personally, or who had not seen him anywhere except on TV, because there is nothing about Jimmy Carter that would make him any more noticeable than anyone else you might pass in one of those long and crowded corridors in O'Hare. He could pass for a Fuller Brush man on any street in America, but if Jimmy Carter had decided 15 years ago to sign on as a brush and gimcrack salesman for the Fuller people, he would be president of the Fuller Brush Company today, and every medicine chest in the country would be loaded with Carter Fuller brushes. And if he had gone into the heroin business, every respectable household between Long Island and Los Angeles would have at least one resident junkie. But that is not what we need to be talking about right now, is it? The only thing I remember about the first hour or so of that luncheon was a powerful sense of depression with the life I was drifting into. According to the program, we were in for a long run of speeches, remarks, comments, etc., on matters connected with the law school. Carter and Kennedy were the last two names on the list of speakers, which meant there was no hope of leaving early. I thought about going back to the beer parlor and watching a baseball game on TV, but King warned me against it. "We don't know how long this goddamn thing is gonna last," he said. "And that's a hell of a long walk from here, isn't it?" I knew what he was getting at. Just as soon as the program was over, the SS Caravan would rush us out to the Athens airport, where Carter's plane was waiting to fly us back to Atlanta. Another big dinner banquet was scheduled for 6:30 that night, and immediately after that, a long flight back to Washington. Nobody would miss me if I wanted to go to the beer parlor, King said, but nobody would miss me when the time came to leave for the airport either. One of the constant nightmares of traveling with politicians is the need to keep them in sight at all times. Every presidential campaign has its own fearful litany of horror stories about reporters and occasionally even a staff member who thought they had plenty of time to run across the street for a quick beer, instead of hanging around in the rear of some grim auditorium half listening to the drone of a long familiar speech, only to come back in 20 minutes to find the auditorium empty and no sign of the press bus, the candidate, or anybody who can tell him where they went. These stories are invariably set in places like Butte, Buffalo, or Ice Pick, Minnesota, on a night in the middle of March. The temperature is always below zero. There is usually a raging blizzard to keep cabs off the street, and just as the victim remembers that he has left his wallet and his overcoat on the press bus, his stomach erupts with a sudden attack of ptomaine poisoning. And then, while crawling around on his knees in some ice-covered alley and racked with fits of projectile vomiting, he is grabbed by vicious cops and whipped on the shins with a nightstick, and then locked in the drunk tank of the local jail and buggered all night by winos. These stories abound, and there is just enough truth in them to make the most campaign journalists so fearful of a sudden change in the schedule that they will not even go looking for a bathroom until the pain becomes unendurable, and at least 3 reliable people have promised to fetch them back to the fold at the first sign of any movement that could signal an early departure. The closest I ever came to getting left behind was during the California primary in 1972, when I emerged from a bathroom in the Salinas Railroad Depot and realized that the caboose car of McGovern's victory train was about 100 yards further down the tracks than it had been only 3 minutes earlier. George was still standing outside the platform waving to the crowd, but the train was moving, and as I started my sprint through the crowd, running over women, children, cripples, and anything else that I couldn't get out of my way, I thought I saw a big grin on McGovern's face as the train began picking up speed. I am still amazed that I caught up with the goddamn thing without blowing every valve in my heart, or even missing the iron ladder when I made my last second leap and being swept under the train and chopped in half by the wheels. Ever since then, I have not been inclined to take many risks while traveling in strange territory with politicians. Even the very few who I might feel a bit guilty about leaving me behind would have to do it anyway, because they are all enslaved by their schedules. And when it comes to a choice between getting to the airport on time or waiting for a journalist who has wandered off to seek booze, they will shrug and race off to the airport. This is particularly true when you travel with Kennedy, who moves at all times with a speedy split-second precision, on a schedule that nobody except a perfectly organized presidential candidate would even try to keep pace with. When he is traveling with a detail of Secret Service agents, the caravan stops for nothing and waits for nobody. The SS agents assigned to Kennedy are hypersensitive about anything that might jack up the risk factor, and they move on the theory that safety increases with speed. There was no need for King and Kirk to warn me that the SS detail would have a collective nervous breakdown at the prospect of taking Senator Kennedy and the governor of Georgia through the streets of downtown Athens, or any other city for that matter, to search for some notoriously criminal journalists who might be in any one of the half-dozen bars and beer parlors on the edge of the campus. So there was nothing to do except sit there in the university cafeteria, slumped in my chair at a table right next to Dean Rusk's, and drink one tall glass after another of straight wild turkey until the Law Day luncheon ceremonies were finished. After my third trip out to the trunk, the SS driver apparently decided that it was easier to just let me keep the car keys instead of causing a disturbance every 15 or 20 minutes by passing them back and forth, which made a certain kind of fatalistic sense, because I'd already had plenty of time to do just about anything I wanted to do with the savage contents of his trunk, so why start worrying now? We had, after all, been together for the better part of 2 days, and the agents were beginning to understand that there was no need to reach for their weapons every time I started talking about the blood on Dean Rusk's hands, or how easily I could reach over and cut off his ears with my steak knife. Most Secret Service agents have led a sheltered life, and they tend to get edgy when they hear that kind of talk from a large stranger in their midst who has managed to stash an apparently endless supply of powerful whiskey right in the middle of their trunk arsenal. That is not one of your normal everyday situations in the SS life, and especially not when this drunkard who keeps talking about taking a steak knife to the head of a former Secretary of State has a red flag on his file in the Washington SS headquarters, in addition to having the keys to the SS car in his pocket. Carter was already speaking when I came back from my 4th or 5th trip out to the car. I had been careful all along to keep the slice of lemon on the rim of the glass, so it looked like all the other iced tea glasses in the room. But Jimmy King was beginning to get nervous about the smell. "God damn, Hunter, this whole end of the room smells like a distillery," he said. "Balls," I said. "That's blood you're smelling." King winced, and I thought I saw Rusk's head start to swing around me, but apparently he thought better of it. For at least 2 hours he'd been hearing all this ugly talk about blood coming over his shoulder from what he knew was the Kennedy table right behind him. But why would a group of Secret Service agents and Senator Kennedy's personal staff be talking about him like that? And why was this powerful stench of whiskey hanging around his head? Were they all drunk? Not all, but I was rapidly closing the gap, and the others had been subjected to the fumes for so long that I could tell by the sound of their laughter that even the SS agents were acting a little weird. Maybe it was a contact drunk of some kind, acting in combination with the fumes of fiendish drone of the speeches. We were trapped in that place, and nobody else at the table liked it any better than I did. I am still not sure when I began listening to what Carter was saying, but at some point, about 10 minutes into his remarks, I noticed a marked difference in the style and tone of the noise coming from the speaker's table, and I found myself listening for the first time all day. Carter had started off with a few quiet jokes about people feeling honored to pay $10 or $12 a head to hear Kennedy speak, but the only way he could get people to listen to him was to toss in a free lunch along with his remarks. The audience laughed politely a few times, but after he'd been talking for about 15 minutes, I noticed a general uneasiness in the atmosphere of the room, and nobody was laughing anymore. At that point, we were all still under the impression that Carter's remarks would consist of a few minutes of friendly talk about the law school, a bit of praise for Rusk, an introduction to Kennedy, and that would be it. But we were wrong, and the tension in the room kept increasing as more and more people realized it. A few, if any of them, had supported Carter when he won the governorship, and now that he was just about finished with his 4-year term and barred by law from running again, they expected him to bow out gracefully and go back to raising peanuts. If he had chosen that occasion to announce that he'd decided to run for president in 1976, the reaction would almost certainly have been a ripple of polite laughter, because they would know he was kidding. Carter had not been a bad governor, but so what? We were, after all, in Georgia, and besides that, the South already had one governor running for president. Back in the spring of 1974, George Wallace was a national power. He had rattled the hell out of that big cage called the Democratic National Committee in 72, and when he said he planned to do it again in 76, he was taken very seriously. So I would probably have chuckled along with the others if Carter had said something about running for president at the beginning of his remarks that day, but I would not have chuckled if he'd said it at the end, because it was a king-hell bastard of a speech, and by the time it was over he had rung every bell in the room. Nobody seemed to know exactly what to make of it, but they knew it was sure as hell not what they'd come to hear. I have heard hundreds of speeches by all kinds of candidates and politicians, usually against my will, and for generally the same reasons I got trapped into hearing this one. But I have never heard a sustained piece of political oratory that impressed me any more than the speech Jimmy Carter made on that Saturday afternoon in May 1974. It ran about 45 minutes, climbing through 5 very distinct gear changes, while the audience muttered uneasily and raised their eyebrows at each other. And one of the most remarkable things about the speech is that it is such a rare piece of oratorical artwork that it remains vastly impressive, even if you don't necessarily believe Carter was sincere and truthful in all the things he said. Viewed purely in the context of rhetorical drama and political theater, it ranks with General Douglas MacArthur's Old Soldiers Never Die address to the Congress in 1951, which still stands as a masterpiece of insane bullshit, if nothing else. There were, however, a lot of people who believed every word and sigh of MacArthur's speech, and they wanted to make him president. Just as a lot of people who are still uncertain about Jimmy Carter would want to make him president if he could figure out some way to deliver a contemporary version of his 1974 Law Day speech on network TV. Or, hell, even the same identical speech. A national audience might be slightly puzzled by some of the references to obscure judges, grade school teachers, and backwoods Georgia courthouses, but I think the totality of the speech would have the same impact today as it did 2 years ago. But there is not much chance of it happening, and that brings up another remarkable aspect of the Law Day speech. It had virtually no impact at all when he delivered it, except on the few people who heard it, and most of them were more stunned and puzzled by it than impressed. They had not come here to hear lawyers denounced as running dogs of the status quo, and there is still some question in my own mind, and in Carter's too, I suspect, about what he came there to say. There was no written text of the speech, no press to report it, no audience hungry to hear it, and no real reason for giving it, except that Jimmy Carter had a few serious things on his mind that day, and he figured it was about time to unload them, whether the audience liked it or not. Which gets to another interesting point of the speech. Although Carter himself now says, "That was probably the best speech I ever made," he has yet to make another one like it. Not even to the extent of lifting some of the best images and ideas of incorporation into his current speeches. and his campaign staff attached so little importance to it that Carter's only tape recording of his Law Day remarks got lost somewhere in the files, and, until about 2 months ago, the only existing tape of the speech was the one I had copied off the original before it was lost. I've been carrying the bastard around with me for 2 years, playing it in some extremely unlikely situations for people who would look at me like I was finally over the hump into terminal brain damage when I'd say they were going to have to spend the next 45 minutes listening to a political speech by some ex-governor of Georgia. It was not until I showed up in New Hampshire and Massachusetts for the 76 primaries that I started playing my tape of the Law Day speech for a few friends, journalists, and even some of Carter's top staff people who'd never heard it, that Pat Caddell noticed that almost everybody who heard the speech was as impressed by it as I was. But even now, after Caddell arranged to dub 50 tape copies off my copy, nobody in Carter's brain trust has figured out what to do with them. I am not quite sure what I would do with them myself if I were Carter, because it is entirely possible that the very qualities that made the Law Day speech so impressive for me would have exactly the opposite effect on Carter's new national constituency. The voice I hear on my tape is the same one all those good conservative folks out there on the campaign trail have found so appealing, but very few of them would find anything familiar in what the voice is saying. The Jimmy Carter who has waltzed so triumphantly down the middle of the road through one Democratic primary after another is cautious, conservative, and vaguely ethereal Baptist Sunday school teacher who seems to promise, above all else, a return to normalcy, a resurrection of the national self-esteem, and a painless redemption from all the horrors and disillusion of Watergate. With President Carter's firm hand on the helm, the ship of state will once again sail a true and steady course. All the crooks and liars and thieves who somehow got control of the government during the turmoil of the 60s will be driven out of the temple once and for all, and the White House will be so overflowing with honesty, decency, justice, love, and compassion that it might even glow in the dark. It is a very alluring vision, and nobody understands this better than Jimmy Carter. The electorate feels a need to be cleansed, reassured, and revitalized. The underdogs of yesteryear have had their day, and they blew it. The radicals and reformers of the 60s promised peace, but they turned out to be nothing but incompetent troublemakers. Their plans had looked so fine on paper, led to chaos and disaster when hack politicians tried to implement them. The promise of civil rights turned into the nightmare of busing. The call for law and order led straight to Watergate, and the long struggle between the hawks and the doves caused violence in the streets and a military disaster in Vietnam. Nobody won in the end, and when the dust finally settled, extremists at both ends of the political spectrum were thoroughly discredited. And by the time the 1976 presidential campaign got underway, the high ground was all in the middle of the road. Jimmy Carter understands this, and he has tailored his campaign image to fit the new mood almost perfectly. But back in May of '74, when he flew up to Athens to make his remarks at the Law Day ceremonies, he was not as concerned with preserving his moderate image as he is now. He was thinking more about all the trouble he'd had with judges, lawyers, lobbyists, and other minions of the Georgia establishment while he was governor. And now, with only 6 more months in office, he wanted to have a few words with these people. There was not much anger in his voice when he started talking, but halfway through the speech it was too obvious for anybody in the room to ignore. But there was no way to cut him short, and he knew it. It was the anger in his voice that first caught my attention, I think. But what sent me back out to the trunk to get my tape recorder instead of another drink was the spectacle of a Southern politician telling a crowd of Southern judges and lawyers that I'm not qualified to talk to you about law because in addition to being a peanut farmer, I'm an engineer and a nuclear physicist, not a lawyer. But I read a lot and I listen a lot. One of the sources for my understanding about the proper application of criminal justice and the system of equities is from Reinhold Niebuhr. The other source of my understanding about what's right and wrong in this society is from a friend of mine, a poet named Bob Dylan. Listening to his records about the lonesome death of Hattie Curl and Like a Rolling Stone and the times they are changing, I've learned to appreciate the dynamicism of change in a modern society. At first I was sure I was hearing him right, and I looked over at Jimmy King. "What the hell did I just hear?" I asked. King smiled and looked at Paul Kirk, who leaned across the table and whispered, "He said his top two advisors are Bob Dylan and Reinhold Niebuhr." I nodded and got up to go outside for my tape recorder. I could tell by the rising anger in Carter's voice that we were in for an interesting ride, and by the time I got back, he was whipping on the crowd about judges who took bribes in return for reduced prison sentences, lawyers who deliberately cheated illiterate blacks, and cops who abused people's rights with something they called a consent warrant. I had lunch this week with the members of the Judicial Selection Committee, and they were talking about a consent search warrant, he said. I didn't know what a consent search warrant was. They said, "Well, that's when two policemen go to a house. One of them goes to the front door and knocks on it, and the other one runs around to the back and yells, 'Come in!'" The crowd got a laugh out of that one, but Carter was just warming up for the next 20 or 30 minutes. His voice was the only sound in the room. Kennedy was sitting just a few feet to Carter's left, listening carefully but never changing the thoughtful expression on his face as Carter railed and bitched about the system of criminal justice that allows the rich and the privileged to escape punishment for their crimes and sends poor people to prison just because they can't afford to bribe the judge. Jesus babbling Christ, the phone is ringing again, and this time I know what it is for sure. Last time it was the land commissioner of Texas, threatening to have my legs broken because of something I wrote about him. But now it is the Grim Reaper. He has come for my final page, and in exactly 13 minutes that goddamn mojo wire across the room will erupt in a frenzy of beeping, and I will have to feed it again. But before I leave this filthy sweatbox that is costing me $39 a day, I am going to deal with that rotten mojo machine. I have dreamed of smashing that fucker for 5 long years. But, okay, 12 more minutes, and yes. So this will have to be it. I would need a lot more time and space than I have to properly describe either the reality or the reaction to Jimmy Carter's Law Day speech, which was and still is the heaviest and most eloquent thing I have ever heard from the mouth of a politician. It was the voice of an angry agrarian populist, extremely precise in its judgments, and laced with some of the most original, brilliant, and occasionally bizarre political metaphors anybody in that room will ever be likely to hear. The final turn of the screw was another ugly example of crime and degradation in the legal profession, and this time Carter went right to the top. Nixon had just released his own self-serving version of the White House tapes, and Carter was shocked when he read the transcripts. The Constitution charges us with a direct responsibility for determining what our government is and ought to be, he said. And then, after a long pause, he went on. Well, I have read parts of the embarrassing transcripts, and I have seen the proud statement of a former attorney general who protected his boss, and now brags of the fact that he tiptoed through a minefield and came out, quote, clean, unquote. Another pause, and then, you know, I can't imagine somebody like Thomas Jefferson tiptoeing through a minefield on the technicalities of the law and then bragging about being clean afterwards. 45 minutes later, on our way back to Atlanta in the governor's small plane, I told Carter I wanted a transcript of his speech. There is no transcript, he said. I smiled, thinking he was putting me on. The speech had sounded like a product of 5 or 6 tortured drafts, but he showed a page and a half of scrawled notes in his legal pad and said that was all he had. Jesus Christ, I said. That was one of the damnedest things I've ever heard. You mean you just winged it all the way through? He shrugged and smiled faintly. Well, he said, I had a pretty good idea of what I was going to say before I came up here, but I guess I was a little surprised at how it came out. Kennedy didn't have much to say about the speech. He said he'd enjoyed it, but he still seemed uncomfortable and preoccupied for some reason. Carter and I talked about the time he invited Dylan and some of his friends out to the governor's mansion after a concert in Atlanta. I really enjoyed it, he said with a big grin. It was a real honor to have him visit my home. I had already decided by then that I liked Jimmy Carter, but I had no idea that he'd made up his mind a few months earlier to run for the presidency in 1976. And if he had told me his little secret that day on the plane back to Atlanta, I'm not sure I'd taken him seriously. But if he had told me, and if I had taken him seriously, I would have probably said that he could have my vote for no other reason except the speech I'd just heard. Which hardly matters, because Jimmy Carter didn't mention the presidency to me that day, and I had other things on my mind. It was the first Saturday in May, Derby Day in Louisville, and I'd been harassing Jimmy King since early morning about getting us back to Atlanta in time to watch the race on TV. According to the schedule, we were due back at the governor's mansion around 3 in the afternoon, and post time for the Derby was 4:30. But I have learned to be leery of politicians' schedules. They are about as reliable as campaign promises. And when I'd mentioned to Kennedy that I felt it was very important to get ourselves back to Atlanta in time for the Derby, I could tell by the look in his face that the only thing that might cause him to go out of his way to watch the Kentucky Derby was a written guarantee from the Churchill Downs management that I would be staked down on the track at the finish line when the horses came thundering down the stretch. But Carter was definitely up for it, and he assured me that we would be back at the mansion in plenty of time for me to make all the bets I wanted before post time. We'll even try to find a mint julep for you, he said. Rosalind has some mint in the garden, and I notice you already have the main ingredient. When we got to the mansion, I found a big TV set in one of the basement guest rooms. The mint juleps were no problem, but the only bet I could get was a $5 gig with Jody Powell, Carter's press secretary, which I won, and then compounded the insult by insisting that Powell pay off immediately. He had to wander around the mansion, borrowing dollars and even quarters from anybody who would lend him money, until he could scrape up $5. Later that night we endured another banquet, and immediately after, I flew back to Washington with Kennedy, King, and Kirk. Kennedy was still in a funk about something, and I thought it was probably me, and while it was true that I had not brought any great distinction to the entourage, I had made enough of an effort to know that it could have been worse. And just to make sure he understood that, or maybe for reasons of sheer perversity, I waited until we were all strapped into our seats, and I heard stewardess asking Teddy if she could bring him a drink. He refused, as he always does in public, and just as the stewardess finished her spiel, I leaned over the seat and said, "How about some heroin?" His face went stiff, and for a moment I thought it was all over for me, but then I noticed that King and Kirk were smiling. So I strangled the Sloat and walked back to my hotel in the rain.
What you think you've given is not what the world has received. Can you feel the distance between what you think you know, what you know, what you think you know, what you know, what you think you know, what you know, what you think you know, what's that in your heart? What's that in your head? What's that in your heart? What's that in your head? The chords and tones and phrases
All right, that was the episode.
What a treat. How great was that?
Yeah, I gotta say, almost as good as the Great Shark Hunt. The Great Shark Hunt was
They're good in their own ways.
incredible. Yeah, different though.
Different,
Definitely
yeah,
different.
for sure.
You
But
get
both great.
you almost get the other side of Hunter S Thompson's writing with this one because he did a lot of political writing.
Yeah.
and that's what this one was all about. So in the future, I plan on doing many more of these. In fact, I think I'm gonna spend a lot of time next month just reading shit into the mic and storing files on FL Studio.
That's a great idea.
That way, if we have months like this where we have plenty of bandwidth left to upload some episodes, we'll just throw those files up.
Wonder
and-
what it's like to be in that guy's head.
Mm,
What it must have been like.
must be a jangled mess
Yeah.
at all times.
Craziness.
Didn't you like
Craziness
that?
and greatness.
Like that part where he described his feelings on breakfast.
Oh, I know.
I mean, that is incredible.
Yeah.
And then just the whole rundown about what it takes to cover a campaign in the middle of a presidential election.
Yeah,
That's a
it's crazy.
first-rate insight. So that is the episode. That's the bonus episode. We're gonna get this out before the new year, which we've got New Year's Eve tomorrow.
Woohoo!
Probably won't have much to do after I get these 2 episodes out. So after that, it's just gonna be on to 2019.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's
That
already
year flew
2019.
by.
Yep.
Where's the time going?
So we've got lofty goals for the show in next year. Rest assured, we're going to keep this train rolling.
Yep. It's
And,
non-stop now.
Although life is hitting us like a sack of bricks,
It sure is.
that's fine because
That's okay.
it's gonna be great to take a
We'll put our boxing gloves on and
knock it
eat
out.
that bitch.
It's gonna be nice to take a break every week or so just to focus on the show.
Yeah.
And put out quality episodes. So
That'll be our exciting time.
I'd love to
Our
hear
break from
what
life.
you guys think of the show, of the and specifically of these Hunter S Thompson short stories. Hit us up on Twitter at Undoctrinated1. Hit us up on, if you'd like, Instagram. We're on there too.
Undoctrinated podcast.
And you can
I'm
send
gonna
us
start
an email.
posting more on Instagram too. Sorry
Yeah,
about that. people.
Natalie's really been slacking on the Instagram, and she wants to apologize
I
here
do.
and
I'm
now
really
for that.
sorry. There's just been some things going on, but don't worry. I'm gonna get back at it.
I do continuously
still
get
love you.
alerts on my phone that we just keep getting followers on that though, so that's cool. For whatever reason, we just don't get Twitter followers, but
That's because you need to let me handle that.
I know I'm not.
Just kidding.
Here I am criticizing you about your activity on Instagram when I don't. I pretty much neglect the Twitter too, but
No,
nobody hits us up on Twitter, so maybe
okay.
when we start getting some feedback on there, I'll be a little more active. But I guess I should probably be posting more, and then maybe that'll lead to feedback.
Yeah.
Whatever the case, if you don't tweet and if you don't do Instagram, send us a fucking email.
Yeah, people
That's
still email.
undoctrinatedpodcast at
gmail.com.
gmail.com.
Yeah, Gmail. Good old Gmail.
Subscribe to the show, and if you really want to help out, write a review, and we'll get this thing off the ground. All right, on to next year. Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year's, everybody. Stay safe. Goodbye.
Obsession has an odor. Tunnel vision has a tell. Fanatical behavior seems to fit you well. Fixate on what you think you know. You're missing what you don't know. Crazy wouldn't notice. Have a lovely life in your chosen hell. Metaphors just point the way towards untouchable ideas. Fixating on the finger, miss the point, dull the point as well.
Miss the point, dull the point, miss the point, dull the point.
Obsession has an odor. Tunnel vision has a tell. It's fanatical behavior. Have a lovely life in your chosen hell.